I'm Tom Gilson, Associate Editor of Against the Grain, and I'm here in downtown Charleston at the Francis Marion Hotel in the Penthouse Suites. And I'm joined by Audrey Powers, who is the Associate Librarian at the University of South Florida. And we're here to talk to John Rennie, who is the Editorial Director of Access Science, the online reference work published by McGraw-Hill. John is also the former editor of Scientific American. John, welcome to the Penthouse.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
We are delighted to have you. This morning, both Audrey and I attended your session, and it was entitled Science Education Gone Wild, Creating Science References That Work. And I just wonder, what do you mean by science references that work?
Sure, it was, I suppose, a little bit cryptic that way. But in some respects, I did want to leave it open to whatever people might want it to take it to be. Because I think the challenge for all of us who are involved in trying to create new sorts of science texts or references of any kind is making sure that they are doing for the actual users, not even just the intended users, but the actual users, precisely what they should be doing. And I think that if we look at where there are failures in the state of that kind of science publishing these days, one of the ways in which that may arise is that we haven't precisely squared what we're trying to give them with what they want.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And so science references that work are ones that actually work for the user as opposed to the publisher or the authors.
That's right, and I think that's sort of the interesting change in emphasis. This is obviously a gross generalization, and it does a huge disservice to a lot of very good people who've been involved in all this. But the nature of traditional publishing was, of course, that you had various scientific authorities, the scientists, experts themselves, who are often the authors of the works. The publishers were organizing the information that they had into some coverage of an area, and then librarians and faculty were involved in being able to try to make that work available to the students or whatever scholars were involved. A great system we'd had a lot of benefits from, but the problem is that it doesn't necessarily mean that the students who will be getting those will actually be able to take advantage of this. These days, particularly because of the rise of different sorts of digital works, but also just frankly because of all the competing demands on people's attention, I think it's more important than ever that we really need to try to make sure that the scientific texts and references really are aimed at exactly what it is that those users need and want, and we have some ways of tapping into that.
In line with that, getting more specific about the writing that you see in the current scholarly academic journals, how does that writing compare to what you used to see in Scientific American? And I'm thinking, how could it be improved?
Well, so of course there's huge range. I mean, I'm afraid to generalize too much about all this because you do have, for example, scientists and scientific authors who are terrific and some who are not so terrific. Let's face it, we go to them as great scientists because of their thinking abilities, not because they necessarily are gifted writers or communicators. I would say that a persistent problem that has run through the body of most scientific communications back for decades has been really the institutionalized sense, for example, that scientists are coached to try to leave themselves back out of this. Now, naturally, part of that goes to trying to foster the kind of critical, objective detachment that's supposed to be part of the scientific process, but it means that the works that are the records of what was done and that lay out the reasons for why someone should care about it often are much drier and very off-putting, certainly to modern eyes.
How could it be improved?
Well, there are a lot of different ways. But probably, I think one of the most important things to start with is that we should be careful of falling into the trap to think that there are ways of improving it that will work for all audiences. The kinds of improvements and the sorts of presentations that make most sense for example, presenting new scientific results in the context of a set of experiments that need to be examined very critically and skeptically, that may be very different from the way you want to try to present that information to, a sophomore at college someplace who's trying to find out about something and looking to get excited and wondering, why should I care about this?
which leads to my question, because you talked a lot about education and educating students with science. How can academic science journals be made more relevant and meaningful to college students?
I mean, to be fair, I think there's been a lot of movement on that front already, in that what we're seeing is that a lot of the journals, I think, have been trying to push the level of the writing to a higher level. A lot of them do things such as they increase the kind of front of the book items that have science news or coverage or commentary on the newly published results themselves. All of that sort of additional material is doing a lot to give a sort of second take or a different presentation of that information that in some cases is a lot more accessible to people who are new to any particular field. So that's one thing that they are definitely doing. I mean, I think what will be very interesting is the kind of potentially experimentation we can get into when you have digital formats that, for example, as some of the people in the session were pointing out today, one of the things that you can shake off is the linear presentation that we're used to having in print. It's true that in print you can jump back and forth and read different parts of things. That's one of the great advantages of print. But the temptation, the default for a lot of people is to start at the beginning and read through to the end. And my hypothetical sophomore is probably bored to tears by the time he's gotten through the materials and the methods and no better, more enlightened. So digitally we may have other ways of being able to shake that up.
How can science publishers, librarians, and libraries, as you say in your quote, inspire serious study habits in students, such as the willingness to delve into the serious journal literature?
Right. I mean, I think that obviously it's always, they're the kinds of things that great teachers and librarians have always been able to do, of just inspiring a certain love of knowledge, and that is still always true. What I've been paying a lot of attention to these days is trying to exploit something that we all know is true, is that so often people start off very enthusiastic about science when they were young, and then I fear that something about the educational process or life or something just squeezes that back out of them. And the cliche about that all children are sort of natural scientists because they're always asking questions and wondering why things work. Long past childhood, we all have different kinds of enthusiasms and curiosities, and I think that we want to encourage people to think of that as scientific, and where people have a lot of natural interests in something, to just encourage them to do things like, well, let's take that question seriously. There are ways that people have been exploring this kind of thing of how would you investigate this more. So that does come from having the right kinds of texts and reference works. But I think even the kind of really fascinating movement that's taking root in a lot of libraries and schools for the maker movement and these sort of maker spaces where people are doing things like bringing in some kinds of tools for 3D printers and laser cutters, which makes it very, very easy for people who are not traditionally schooled in certain kinds of skills to be involved in building things. And that's always been a great avenue for trying to encourage people to get involved in science and technology. Look at how robotics competitions have taken off among kids. I mean, Lego is a robot company. I think that's sort of fascinating these days. So there's a perfect example of a way where you can tie into something that kids just naturally love. They love to build robots, and you can turn that into a launch pad for so many other further scholarly interests.
So my next question, you may have answered it a little bit. I was going to ask you, as the editorial director of McGraw-Hill Educational Access Science, how do you approach challenges that prohibit students or children from not taking very kindly to science.
No, it's a lot to take into account, and there's no question that obviously with Access Science, I mean, Access Science is a particular product. It does go to lots of different kinds of students in lots of different settings. So everything from kind of bright high school students up through post-grads and even people in professional settings too sometimes use it. So it is tough that you don't have just one narrowly defined audience.
Right.
So you have to try to figure out what you're going to do, and to a certain extent, though there are not perfect solutions that work for everyone, there are certain kind of universal constants that work well. So you can start to do things like try to make sure that major points, if you've got, say, a lengthy entry on any particular topic, trying to have an introduction that may give almost like bullet points of certain key major takeaways, just on the assumption that, well, what if people don't even get past this, or if they are looking to know what they are going to get out of it as they're going through. So part of it is a matter of making those kinds of changes. Everything that's involved in trying to dispel confusion is very important, because confusion is one of the great turnoffs in any kind of scientific work.
Right.
So we keep trying to find the different kinds of tools of, if somebody's reading through this passage and right about here they run into these words, what kind of additional explanation do we want to have? Either in the text itself, or is there something like a link that we want to have very appropriate that would provide that sort of information? And a link could be, a DOI to scholarly papers on that for people who want to go and, immediately they want to go into more depth about that. We're even looking into things about, again, some of these things in the kind of the do-it-yourself space, about whether there are relevant projects to be able to be able to present.
Yeah.
So it's actually a very exciting time to be doing that.
Yeah, great ideas.
Switching gears a little bit, what do you think the impact of digital publishing has been on science publication? Things, open access, one, you mentioned in your talk blogging.
Yep.
Can you just tell us a little bit about how you perceive these things?
Sure. A very big question with lots and lots of different answers to that. In no particular order, one of the things that's happened, one major impact about the rise of digital publication is that, maybe for better or worse, it's contributed to the proliferation of different specialized journals. There are lots of journals on particular subject areas now that can exist because the financials for something like that can be supported digitally, but they couldn't be supported in print model without charging exorbitant prices for them. So that's one thing. I think what's great is that with the rise of the web and the kind of the science blogging movement or phenomenon of that, of however we want to refer to it, that's had a kind of wonderfully democratizing effect in that you are getting so much more science writing and science communication if we bundle in things that people are doing with videos and podcasts and other kinds of multimedia presentations that are all great. Widely varying quality, of course. Some of it is dreadful. Some of it is as good or better than anything that's ever existed before. What goes along with a lot of that that's been so beneficial is that you actually do have this community of science writers and enthusiastic science readers, and that social aspect can do a lot to help people navigate to the best of the stuff. And I think that's great, because so we're seeing more good science communication, and we're getting some kinds of voices and personalities, people who maybe once would have been too marginalized, that they're getting opportunities to be brought into this. Some kinds of critical commentary about what's happening in science or in science publishing. I think that's great to have a voice for all that. Open access, giant can of worms all in itself, and by point of disclosure, obviously having worked at Scientific American for years, which is owned by Macmillan and also owns the Nature Publishing Group, so I'm used to definitely being kind of a part of a group that's been involved in traditional scientific publishing. But I've also been a blogger for the Public Library of Science and have commented a lot, often very enthusiastically, about a lot of things in the open access publishing too. I think the emergence of open access has frankly been a very good thing. I think that it because obviously I'm enthusiastic about anything that makes it easier for more people to be able to get good science, access to this sort of thing. There are a lot of questions about whether the way that open access is done now necessarily always is the best way to do that. There are important questions about who, one way or the other, somebody does pay for any of this, whether it's actually in money or whether it's in investments of time and talent, and I don't think we have very good systems for working all of that out. But I think that's something where, again, a lot of the kind of the marketplace of those who will be consuming all of this content over time, that's going to take shape. Whether or not I think it's useful that, in a sense, that the gauntlet's been thrown down to traditional publishers, that insofar as what they are doing is supposed to there's supposed to be added value to that beyond just kind of the other process of scientists looking at the work. They need to prove that. And I think that's actually been very encouraging, because we've seen a lot of cases they have, or they've taken extra steps to try to bring a stronger game. So I think painful, and there's probably a lot of brutal misunderstanding on both sides about all of that, but overall I do feel like the emergence of that has been very beneficial to most of us.
Yeah, I think it's been disruptive, but it certainly has been enabled more creativity and so on.
I'd agree.
You've kind of hinted at an answer to this next question, but with all of these different factors, all of this, the digital options and so on, there's been an exponential growth in science publication. Do you think it's still manageable?
That is definitely a tricky problem. I mean, the sort of the tools for discovery and finding your way to these things, that's one of the key issues, because good things do have to stand out against an awful lot of noise these days. The rise of different sorts of, Google and everything else for the engines, that's great. It's always tricky when those kinds of things can easily be gamed. The social component as an overlay on this has been very important. The other kinds of discovery services, everything that's being done. I think we're still finding that a lot of the best science is still managing to punch its way through a lot of that. But I think we do still also need to acknowledge that one way or the other, a lot of what's helping that punch its way through are a lot of the things that have been the traditional advantages, in that they are associated with big-name journals from big-name scientists or big-name publishers. Quite frankly, it's an advantage to be a science researcher working in the United States as opposed to one working in a lot of other less developed countries, as has been documented over time. If I'm I could be a brilliant researcher working in Brazil, and there are a lot of brilliant scientists working in Brazil, but they may have harder times getting some of their papers into those top-tier journals than ones who are working just in the United States will. So, the kind of the old boy network or the traditional strengths, those are still in play, but we'll see how much those do remain the strengths that they were.
How feasible, how feasible is it to embed media into online science journals, and how does that enhance science education?
Boy, from the technical standpoint, that's somebody else's specialty. That's the kind of question I ask them. But I think the advantage of it is pretty clear cut. Science video it catches people's attention, and it gets watched a lot. There's an almost bottomless demand for more good video. Key part of that being good video, and one of the big things that stops that is that it's cost and time and a lot of creativity. Yeah.
I changed my question from is it feasible to how feasible is it?
That's the thing we're all trying to work out. Because also a lot of those things, the things that work best tend to be relatively short presentations of things. There's not a lot of demand for, I think I will sit down and watch this science documentary for an hour. What there's a lot of demand for is kind of the 1 minute, 3 minute short explanation of things. Those are great, but they work with a certain kind of subject matter. So, but I think the opportunity for some of us in that case is where what can we do with aggregating the best of a lot of that? Can we find those good small items, and can we do something by being able to stitch together a lot of those small items, maybe in a matrix of other information that we're providing, that turns that into something that's a little more coherent presentation of a subject matter. But yeah, I mean, the economics on that are very tricky.
Yeah.
Have kind of a trick question, I would say. Kind of a trick question.
I'll fall for it.
If you were sitting in Audrey and my chair, what question would you ask yourself? You can take your time.
Yeah, that's right. Here's a thing that I worry about or grapple with all the time by the nature of what we're doing. It takes time and money and other things to be able to create good, well thought through, polished presentations of anything about what's happening in science. Because it's so complicated, it sometimes takes an extra level of thought. It's more than just reporting like the latest scores coming out of baseball or something. But science is moving along at a kind of blistering pace. So there is that problem that when you are trying to write about this, how do you keep up? So I think that would be kind of my question: is how can science publishers, especially for those of us who are working at that reference level, or the ones where we are past the primary literature, but we are trying to pull together the more coherent threads and messages and present that to a wider audience, whether it's journalistically or educationally. What can we do to try to handle that better than we do right now? So Wikipedia. The great things about Wikipedia, it is indeed about everything, and if something is reported today, it can be in there minutes, hours later. But the quality of that presentation may shift a lot, and it may take a while for some of that to get argued through and cleaned up. Is there a way that has a little more that has better gatekeeping than what is associated with Wikipedia, but that still can manage to have some of its advantages for speed and comprehensiveness? I think that's tough, and I wish I knew I had a great solution for being able to do that, but working on it.
Well, you've asked the question and hinted at a solution. We very much appreciate that.
My pleasure.
Audrey, do you have any other questions?
Well, the one thing that I want to ask you, the last question, is sort of a generalization, but I'm curious to how you respond to this. Why do you think the American public distrusts science?
Oh, wow, that is a lot of questions. There are really reasons for that. Gosh, how do I manage to say nonpartisan through a lot of this?
Exactly.
Let me put it this way, because this is not actually even just strictly sort of a simple partisan issue in the politics. There are various interests that have very clear motivations for why it is that they would prefer to object to or question or at least cast doubt on the messages that start to emerge from a lot of science. And that can be everything having different issues of energy or climate, but also GMOs. There are lots of different issues, and there are lots of different groups of people who may have very good motivations. Sometimes their science is not very good, but it's very easy to muddy the waters on the scientific explanations. I can throw up, I can say things that will distort or misrepresent the findings of science or cast doubt on them much, much faster than people on the other side can clarify those things. So it's that debate is always kind of unfair on those terms. Because a lot of these things are issues that people genuinely, legitimately care very much about and should care very much about, it's understandable that that starts to change things, and people have natural allegiances to ways of life or philosophical views or whatever else, and where science unsettles things, science is going to run into trouble. Science says a lot of things that are very unsettling to what have been very settled ways of life for people. But unfortunately, the science stays true no matter what. So
And that's kind of science's job, is to
yes,
put forth what some might perceive as unsettling truths.
unfortunately, yes, that's right.
Well, John, I want to thank you, and I know Audrey would join me in thanking
Thank
you for
you. Yeah.
taking time out of your busy schedule
Oh.
here at the conference
It's
to
my
come
fun.
and talk to us. It's been a perfect delight. We've really enjoyed it.
Oh, thank you. It's been fun for me, and I've really been very glad to get a chance to talk to you about such fascinating questions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay.